All right. Happy Halloween. I know I have not posted in a long time, kind of, but not really. I've been posting on my gaming channel. I've been doing that some more. But yeah, it is officially Halloween. It is 12:40 my time. And I feel like I need to do this now as opposed to doing this at after I get off work. I don't think that's going to fit the theme and all of that good stuff, I guess, because by the time I get off of work, it's going to be like 8 o'clock, and then I'm going to have to upload and all that. So I'm probably just going to do this very long video here. Well, long to me, for Mr. Ballin. I have been a fan of Mr. Ballin for a long time. This is his most recent video, The Female Charles Manson, the Wicked Witch of the Midwest. I'm assuming that this is going to be in Wisconsin. I don't know why. My first thought is Wisconsin. But yeah, we're just going to hop into it because it's 26 minutes long. I have water boiling, kind of. I just put the bottle on. But yeah. Land. Yeah, okay, wait. Yeah, let's just get started.
In 2005, in a little town in Illinois, three people,
Illinois,
two
cool.
men and a woman, walked into this strange living room inside of an apartment where on the ground was this circle of lit candles. And the
Okay.
trio, without saying anything, just marched into the circle of candles and took seats cross-legged on the ground, all looking inward toward each other. Then, after sitting there for a second,
Okay.
it was like suddenly the air in the room seemed to change, and when that happened, the woman began to speak. Except it wasn't her voice. It was like this dark, guttural voice that almost sounded like a man speaking, but it was clearly coming out of her mouth. But the two men who were sitting in the circle watching this woman, they were expecting this, and so they sat there listening intently for their instructions. And then after they got their instructions, the two men waited for the woman to stop talking, and when she did, she handed them a special tool for the ritual, and then the two men stood up, they said their goodbyes, they turned around, marched outside, hopped in the car, and began driving towards their target. But before we get into that very bizarre story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So, if that's of interest to you, when the like button has just finished raking up all of their fallen leaves in their yard, break out your leaf blower and obliterate all of their piles. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story.
Give me the song. Okay. My first thought, right? I love if you've seen my Spider-Man gameplay, you should know I love making predictions and gloating about how right I was for my predictions. I bet you, I bet you, right, that this of course is fake, right? I bet you that this woman saw the Blair Witch Project and ran with it, right? That's what this feels like. I feel like the inspiration, because he said 2005, right? So it's like, okay, Blair Witch Project came out like what, very late 90s, I think. I'm not sure, but like my first thought was, all right, one woman, two females. It's literally the original Blair Witch. That's what my first thought was, and I would be shocked, absolutely shocked, if if this has nothing to do with that. But yeah.
Just before midnight on August 22nd, 2005, 38-year-old Rick Eck knocked on the front door of an apartment in the tiny Midwestern farm town of Claremont, Illinois. As Rick waited for the door to open, he could barely stand still because he was so excited about what he was going to be doing that night.
Of course.
Finally, the door swung open, and Rick saw right in front of him this very skinny and gaunt-looking woman with dark hair and dark eyes staring back at him. Her name was Irenia Kotner, and she was 34 years old, and by day, she worked at Walmart, but at night, she became the real version of herself. She was a witch who actually led a group of witches known as a coven that Rick was a part of. Without saying anything, Irenia motioned for Rick to follow her into her apartment, and then Irenia turned and began walking away. And Rick, before stepping over the threshold, he paused for a moment and just turned to the guy he had brought with him, a tall, muscular man named David Lindner. And Rick, he just kind of nodded at David, and David nodded back, and then the two of them walked inside. As Rick and David followed Irenia into her apartment, Rick still could barely contain his excitement. He had only joined this coven recently, about a year and a half ago, and so witchcraft, which is something they were going to be doing that night, was kind of new to him, but it was very exciting. Rick had been inspired to become a witch and join this coven after watching the Harry Potter movies, and so he was hopeful that tonight would go something like Harry Potter. And Rick knew...
I'm sorry. Wait. Wait. Okay. Hold on. Alright, let me... Oh my god. Alright, so it's 2005. MySpace was out, I think, around that time, right? So basically social media and clowning on somebody on the internet was pretty much at its infancy, I want to say. So my thought is, right? My thoughts are what are my thoughts here? Like, I don't understand at all how you could possibly think that way. Like, I don't understand whatsoever. There are reference points in life, right? The Salem witch trials. You can make the argument that the Salem witch trials are an important part of history. And again, that's a reference point. So that's way before Harry Potter. And this is in Illinois, so this is in America. I don't understand how you have the luxury to watch a movie and think, hey, cool, magic. There are no other reference points of magic being evil or satanic at all because Harry Potter. Like, I don't get that, right? Have you never seen the Pumpkinhead movie where they literally summon a demonic creature to kill their enemies? Is that not magic? Is the stuff in the Child's Play movies with Chucky not magic? Like, there are so many reference points in pop culture that shows magic in a very negative light. So I don't understand how you can think, oh, you're with these out of shape weirdos who's saying, oh, we're going to do witchcraft. They don't call it magic. They call it witchcraft. That should be a red flag. Me personally, I don't leave the house at all. It took me years just to go into one of my friends' houses. Like, I don't go into other people's houses at all. I don't know. Maybe it's me. But this is already a bunch of red flags. And I don't understand how you can think that this is what that's going to be like. When there's so many ways to think negatively about this. That's all I'm saying. There are more negative reference points than there are positive reference points involving magic. That's all I'm saying.
David, the guy he had brought along, was this very powerful warlock, which is a male witch, and so he figured, if David's here, this is bound to go to plan. Rick just hoped he'd be able to keep up with David, or at least play some sort of meaningful support role.
All right, I have more to say, right? Because he's saying support role. I caught that. Warlock support role. Is he also thinking of Warcraft at the same time? Is that what's happening? When did Warcraft even come out? The only game I played that came out in 2005, actually, KOTOR 2 did come out in 2005, I think. Yeah, I think so. He's talking about warlocks. First of all, I hate playing warlocks in WoW. Honestly, I've tried out every class recently, and it's like, warlocks. I just hate standing still while casting magic. Why is there no red mage type class in WoW? But come on, you're already proving to me that you are an idiot. So I don't have any high hopes for you. I feel like you are going to be sacrificed. That's just my prediction, but let's see.
Irenia eventually led Rick and David down this dark hallway to this small living room where in the middle of the floor was a ring of lit candles. And as soon as Rick and David stepped into the room with Irenia, they were hit with this powerful smell of incense that had been burning in the room. And also there was all this smoke hovering in the air from the various things that Irenia had been burning in preparation for tonight's event.
Of course.
Rick, David, and Irenia walked quietly into the middle of this circle of candles, and they sat down cross-legged
What
in
movie
a
is this
circle
from?
facing each other, and then they got ready to begin. Life in the town of Claremont was normally very quiet and peaceful. I mean, this is a town that literally has more cornfields than people, and Claremont was over 100 miles away from the nearest city. But beneath the calm exterior, Claremont had a dark side. Amongst the 200 or so residents of Claremont were several
200?
very dark witches. Not this coven, not Irenia, Rick, and David. They were the good guys. The dark witches, they were kind of out and about in this town and doing bad things, like practicing evil magic and evil witchcraft.
I'm
So
sorry.
this coven, led by Irenia, was actually in place to try to combat these evil witches in their midst. And tonight, Rick, David, and Irenia were going to attempt to perform their most ambitious and important magic yet. The coven was going to attempt to break a powerful hex, which is kind of like a curse. And this hex was cast by a person who might very well be the worst of all the dark witches in Claremont.
I already see where this is
16-year-old
going.
girl named Lindsay Cassinger.
I-
As Rick sat cross-legged
I
in
already
the
see
middle
where
of the
this is going.
circle, he found himself staring at the two slightly bigger candles that sat in the dead center of the circle, that were basically right between Rick, David, and Irenia. And David, as he stared at these two candles, he saw etched in each of the candles' bodies were words. On one candle it said Lindsay, and on the other candle it was etched baby, because it would turn out this very evil dark witch, Lindsay, was pregnant. And so instead of having to combat one dark soul, the coven would have to combat two, because Lindsay and her baby were kind of intertwined. Now, before this night, the coven had attempted several times to try to break this hex that Lindsay had cast. And the coven believed initially this hex was actually cast directly at Irenia, because Irenia was suffering from things like depression and anxiety and not finding love. And so, of course, that had to be a product of this curse. And as the coven had continued to try and fail at breaking this hex, the hex had only become more powerful and begun to spread from Irenia
I'm not gonna pause,
to other witches,
but I
in
have a
this
lot to
coven
say
who
already.
actually were not present this particular night, including a 20-year-old woman who began complaining of depression and ever-worsening headaches, which of course had to be because of this hex. And so that was why, on this night, the Coven had decided to really beef up their attack on this hex. And so that was why Rick had gone out and brought in David, the experienced warlock from St. Louis, Missouri, who claimed he had broken a hex before and he could do it again for them.
'Twas just getting dark on Halloween night. Monsters and ghosts were out for a fright.
I was not
As
expecting
Rick,
an
Irene,
ad.
and Dave all sat in
Cool.
the circle, they looked at each other, and then
I don't
they began
download my
chanting
videos,
in unison
so that's
to
going to
bring
happen
out
again.
The dead to join them in the living room right now. And as they began this chant, Rick found himself intensely staring at those two candles with Lindsay and Baby on them. And as he stared at the flames dancing across the top of them, Rick started to feel like he was kind of drifting off into a trance-like state. And he knew that based on his prior teachings from Irenia, the leader of this coven, that this must be what it feels like when the spirit world opens up, which means the dead really were coming into the room. And then, as Rick is kind of dealing with this trance-like state, he heard Irenia begin to talk. But it wasn't her normal voice. It was the slow and deep-sounding voice, almost like something had inhabited her body and taken it over and was now speaking through her mouth. And Irenia...
Okay. I need to talk about this now, because there's one thought in my mind right now that is screaming that this, of course this is bullshit. Like, we all know that this is bullshit, but is Irenia suffering from some sort of mental illness, or is she a genius who is setting this up? Because it's clear as day that these two guys are going to murder this pregnant 16-year-old, right? And if I'm not mistaken, the Manson family killed, like, I forgot that famous person who, if I'm not mistaken, she was also pregnant. I'm thinking that Irenia is doing this either to actually try and be like Charles Manson to a degree, and they needed the opportunity of a pregnant girl to show up in their vicinity, or she feels some type of way about this girl, and that's why she's going to send these two guys to murder her, right? There's no way, there is absolutely no reasonable way you can convince me that this is a calculated thing that's happening. You can make the argument that, mental illness. No, there is something that's telling me that this is calculated. Yeah, you can make the argument that, maybe she's just a sociopath. Maybe she's a less intelligent Dexter, because let's be honest here, he wouldn't be telling this story if no one got caught. So I had to express that she's planning this. She is probably drugging these people with incense. I'm telling you that this is fake, and I doubt that she's suffering from mental illness. That I have to say that.
In this kind of slow and strange voice, she would tell Rick and David that the curse is still growing. And then she would say something that totally caught Rick by surprise. She said, again in that slow, strange voice, that the hex now was also on Rick and his entire family, and if they didn't break this hex immediately, Rick and his family would all perish. And when Rick heard this, he's still in this trance-like state, but his heart began racing because he didn't know this hex could potentially affect his loved ones. And so this was a really big deal. They needed to end this hex tonight. Rick listened intently as Irenia began to say in this strange voice what their plan was for that night to break this hex. Basically, Rick and David were going to perform a sacred ritual, and Irenia, she began to say to the spirits in the room that Rick and David, they were ready, but they needed help. And so after she said this, she went quiet, and so too did Rick and David, and they're all just sitting there kind of waiting for something to happen. And then after about a minute of just total silence, Irenia began to speak again, still in this strange, slow, bizarre voice, but Rick and David knew now it was a different voice coming out of her. Now Irenia was speaking on behalf of the spirit world that was in the room with them. And Irenia, she would say in this
Get the
voice,
fuck
I
outta
grant you 5 demons to help you on your quest to break this hex.
the
And then after
fuck
saying this,
outta here.
Irenia, she opened her
Oh my
eyes
God.
and she looked kind of confused for a moment, and then she kind of got her bearings and she looked at David and Rick and she told them, now in her normal voice, that they had to perform this sacred ritual before the 2 candles in the middle with Lindsay and Baby etched on them burned out. And so basically, Rick and David, they needed to get this done tonight. Then Irenia handed David a sacred tool that would be used that night in this sacred ritual that David and Rick were going to complete. And then Rick and David, they would stand up to leave, and before they left, Irenia would give them the typical witch send-off, which was, blessed be. And then Rick and David, they nodded their heads, they turned and walked out of the apartment, and as soon as they were out into the night, Rick could have sworn he saw
those
dark
footsteps
shadows
felt
moving around
real.
all over the place. And he knew right then and there that he and David would be safe that night, because clearly the shadows moving around had to be those 5 demons that Irenia had called forth from the spirit world to protect them this night. And so, feeling very safe and empowered, Rick and David went straight into Rick's car. Rick turned it on and pulled away from the curb and began heading towards their destination.
All right, awesome. An ad.
The other day, old Seagull Lung was looking pretty down, and so naturally, I offered him some of my iced wildebeest retinas to suck on, but he just shook his head and said, Dad, thank you, but what I really need right now is, a bloodthirsty horde of zombies to descend on this town so I can savagely destroy them with various DIY weaponry.
Give me
Alas,
one moment,
zombies
please.
aren't real, and so my dream...
All right, so I had to skip the ad. Zombie game, I guess. Survival mobile thing, whatever. I'm not gonna lie, I also just ate as well. And it's crazy how I started instantly getting paranoid because, like I mentioned, well, it's now 1 now. It's not 12:30 now, but it's 1. And I was just thinking about where my cat is, and I forgot my cat had a bell, and he started moving, and it made me paranoid. Plus, my doorbell camera is not working at this moment, so I'm somewhat paranoid. I'm the only one up now as well. My brother used to stay up all night. Now he's not doing that. So, yeah. Let me just... I also skipped another ad as well. Displayed ad, but,
A few miles away, at the house where the 16-year-old evil witch, Lindsay
I'm not gonna lie, that's a
Cassinger
nice
lives,
house.
a 20-year-old Army private named Joshua Bennett was sitting at the kitchen table in Lindsay's house, eating chicken wings and just kind of enjoying his night. Josh didn't know Lindsay very well, but he wasn't at her house to see Lindsay. He was at her house to see his own mother. And Josh and his mother had a lot of catching up to do. She had abandoned him and his father when he was young, and so Josh's dad had raised him, and then when Josh was old enough, he had joined the military, and now he was about to deploy to the Middle East to go to war, but unexpectedly, Josh's father had died, and so Josh had come back to Illinois for the funeral, and it was at the funeral where he saw his mother. She was in attendance as well, and even though he was upset with his mother for abandoning him, he felt like, you know what, I want to reconnect with her. And so he'd gone over and he'd given her a hug, and his mother had been so touched that she had asked Josh to come by her house in Claremont, Illinois, where she lived with her boyfriend, because she really wanted some alone time to actually hear about Josh's life and kind of, get back together again. And so, of course, Josh had said yes. And so here he was at this house in Claremont.
I'm shocked,
Josh
actually.
had arrived at this house a little bit earlier, and he was surprised to discover that it was not just his mother and her boyfriend living there, but also his mother's boyfriend's son, whose name was Jackie, was also living there, along with his pregnant girlfriend, the evil witch, Lindsay Cassinger.
Oh, that's the girlfriend. Cool.
It was just maybe a little bit confusing that this was kind of a big roommate situation, but it seemed like Jackie and his girlfriend Lindsay were very nice people, and they quickly went downstairs to the apartment in the basement and kind of just stayed out of the way so Josh and his mother could catch up. And so after Josh finished eating his wings, his mother came into the kitchen, and the two of them chatted for hours, and then finally, at about midnight that night, Josh decided to go to bed, so he said goodnight to his mom, he retreated to the bedroom, and he laid in bed. But he couldn't really sleep right away because he had a lot going on in his life. I mean, he had just lost his dad a couple of weeks ago, and then at the same time, he had reconnected with his estranged mother, and he's about to deploy to Iraq, to a war zone, and, he felt ready for that, but at the same time, he was kind of apprehensive. It's about to happen. I hope I'll be able to do my job. And so with all these kind of intense thoughts swirling around his head, he just kind of laid there and didn't really expect to sleep anytime soon. But eventually, Josh did fall asleep. However, it felt like he had only been asleep for a couple of minutes when he was abruptly woken up by the sound of barking coming out from the kitchen. Jackie's dog was going crazy. And so Josh grabbed his phone and he checked the time and saw it was 3 a.m. And so instead of going out there and dealing with this dog, he just thought, you know what, it's going to stop eventually. And so Josh grabbed his pillow and he put it over his head and tried to muffle the sounds so he could fall back asleep. But it didn't work.
I'm sorry for pausing already. In high school, was contemplating on joining the Air Force. And I am someone who tentatively does research for things before I directly get into it. When it comes down to me describing things that I like, I'll just go off of memory. I won't research that because I believe if I like something enough, I shouldn't have to look up details. I should like it enough to be able to remember it and recall it fondly. So when it comes down to things that I want to engage in, I would always do extensive research. So when it comes down to you being military trained and a dog barking, is that not a red flag, or am I giving military trained people too much credit? Because a dog barking at 3 a.m. signifies something, right? Just something. Whether it be an animal that is in close proximity to wake up the dog, whether it be a stranger, it's something. So, I don't know. With this guy being military trained, my first thought was he's going to be the savior of the story. That's my first thought, right? But why does it seem like now he might be the first one to get killed? Because there's no way, there is absolutely no way that this is not going to become a massacre. They're already setting it up. Even though it's 2 people, I don't know if the guy David is really that strong to take on 3 dudes, one being military trained, but I just feel like this is a mistake right here. A very terrible mistake, but whatever.
The dog just kept on barking. And then when Josh took the pillow off his head and kind of sat up, wondering what he should do about this dog situation, he heard the sound of a man's voice, a stranger's voice, saying, "I bring you forth from the dark." And then after Josh heard this, he heard the sound of a woman screaming, and it sounded like his mom. And so acting on instinct, Josh leapt from his bed, he ran out of the room, and he goes into the kitchen, and he sees the dog is jumping and barking and going mad, and his mom is screaming, and there's this guy grabbing her, kind of grappling with her, who's wearing black gloves and a ski mask, and there's another guy next to him with the same getup. It's absolute chaos. But before Josh could run over and save his mother, suddenly his chest felt like it was on fire, and then he went blind, and his eyes had this burning pain in them, and then he couldn't breathe, and he was stumbling backwards, barely able to stand. Minutes later, Rick, who was one of the witches from the coven, bolted out of the front door of Lindsay's house where all this chaos was happening, and he just took off running across the street directly into a cornfield. And as he ran, he felt this throbbing pain in his leg, and he could feel blood pooling in his shoe. Rick ran until he couldn't run any farther, and then he collapsed onto the ground, and then he began thinking about what an absolute disaster it had been inside of the evil witch's house. Not only had they failed to break the hex cast by Lindsay, but also Rick was concerned that David, his partner, who was still at the house, was dead. And Rick, he began looking around wildly, hoping all those demons that were sent to help them from the spirit world, he was hoping they'd be nearby and they'd know what to do. But Rick looked around and there was no one. And so Rick thought for a second, oh my gosh, Lindsay's hex must be stronger than any of us realize. We have to do something now. We have to end this before me and my family get killed too. And so Rick pulled out his phone and he called Irenia, the leader of the coven, to get her advice about what they should do next. But Irenia didn't respond to what Rick was saying the way he expected her to. Instead, she seemed very cold and almost enraged at what he was saying. And then, before Rick could kind of figure out what was going on with Irenia, he heard off in the distance the sound of sirens making their way to the evil witch's house. Over the next few days, police detectives would speak to everyone inside of Irenia's coven, as well as everyone who knew both Irenia and Lindsay. And slowly but surely, the police would put together what actually happened inside of Lindsay, the evil witch's house, in the early morning hours of August 23rd, 2005.
I'm very curious.
At about 3 a.m. on August 23rd, 2005, Rick and David pulled up onto Lindsay's street, and they parked their car a little ways away from Lindsay's house. And then after parking, Rick and David donned their ski masks and their gloves, and then after looking at each other and nodding, they hopped out and began walking towards Lindsay's house. Their plan was to sneak in through one of Lindsay's windows and confront Lindsay the evil witch directly and break the hex by performing a sacred ritual. And then after this ritual was over, they had a second ritual they would need to perform that would send Lindsay's evil soul through the gates of hell. And to do that, they needed the help of the 5 demons that had been sent along by Irenia from the spirit world. Now, Rick and David felt like this was a great plan. However, as soon as they got to Lindsay's house and David actually began trying to climb into one of the windows, everything fell apart.
As a father who works full-time, I want to be an example to show them that even though education and...
I always wanted to play evil online. That was the second ad.
The dog began to bark inside of Lindsay's house, and that alerted Josh's mother, who came into the kitchen and sees the dog and sees David falling through the window. And Rick, who didn't really know what was happening inside the house, he just climbed through the window after David, and when he stood up in the kitchen, he realized it was too late. They were totally caught. And so Rick, not really knowing what to do, he's seeing all this yelling and chaos happening. He looks over at David, and he sees David grab something from his belt, and he pulls it out. And it was the tool that Irenia had given them when they left her apartment to go carry out this sacred ritual. This tool was part of that sacred ritual, and it was a long, sharp knife. And what they were going to do is stab the evil witch, Lindsay Kassinger, to death with it. That was how they were going to break the hex. And then after they killed Lindsay, they were going to perform this weird ritual with her clothing that would send her soul through the gates of hell. Now, Rick did understand that this was the plan. They were going to murder Lindsay, but perhaps he didn't really know how serious David was about carrying it out, or the fact that David was not really a warlock as much as he was a violent criminal who had bragged to Irenia about previously murdering someone who had cast a separate hex. And so by killing this person, that was how David had broken the hex previously.
Of course.
Also, Rick may not have known that David had been instructed by Irenia to not let anything stand in their way to break this hex, to carry out this sacred ritual on Lindsay. And so Rick just watched as David raised the knife and began stabbing Josh's mother over and over again in the chest while screaming, "I bring you forth from the dark." And it was at this point that Josh, the army private who heard all this happening, came charging out in his underwear into the kitchen, and Rick watched as David went from stabbing Josh's mother to turning and immediately stabbing Josh directly in the chest. And Rick, at this point, he just jumped right in on it and pulled out his pepper spray and sprayed Josh in the eyes. And so that was when Josh felt the burning sensation and then went blind and couldn't breathe and fell to the ground. And so now it is absolutely chaos inside of this kitchen, and the actual target of David and Rick's, Lindsay, the evil witch, she managed to run out of the house and run to a nearby neighbor's house to get help. Meanwhile, the evil witch's boyfriend, Jackie, he comes upstairs carrying a shotgun. And at this point, Josh is on the ground, clearly dying from the stab wound to his chest. His mother as well is struggling on the ground, and David is going totally nuts, saying all these strange things and whipping his knife around, and Rick is just totally panicking and doesn't know what to do. And so when Jackie ran at Rick with this shotgun, Rick pulled out his own knife and attempted to stab Jackie, but somehow missed Jackie and stabbed himself in the leg. And so that was why his leg was
Okay. Bro, wait. My first thought was what was the bull name? What was it? Cheddar Bob in 8 Mile when he shot himself in the leg. Was that his name? Cheddar Bob. But wait, I'm just trying to what? Excuse me? I'm sorry. I'm curious as to why Irenia wants this woman dead. But come on. This is not how I thought this was going to go.
Throbbing and bleeding because he had stabbed himself. And then after Rick had stabbed himself, Jackie just walked over and Spartan kicked Rick down the stairs into the basement. And then Jackie turned his attention from Rick to David, who was still just going nuts with this knife and being a total maniac. And Jackie just walked over to David, and David, he sees the shotgun coming over to him, and he tries to move the barrel out of the way, but then somehow only manages to point the gun directly at his own stomach, at which point Jackie just fired a slug directly into David's gut. And it was at this moment, as David is crumpling to the ground with this horrible stomach wound, that the neighbor that Lindsay, the evil witch, had gone to go get, had come to the house. They went inside, and they found a scene of absolute carnage. And before the neighbor could even do anything, Rick, who had stabbed himself in the leg and been kicked down into the basement, had scrambled up the steps and just run right past all the bodies on the ground, past the neighbor who didn't even do anything, outside, and Rick just kept on running out into that cornfield. And so at this point, the neighbor didn't even try to figure out what happened.
God.
He just called 911. But it was already too late
why
for
didn't
Josh,
you call
the Army
911?
private, who was only at this house to reconnect with his estranged mother before he deployed to Iraq. And here he was, dead on the ground from this totally bizarre attack. It would turn out Rick, David, and really the entire coven of witches that fell under Irenia had been totally duped. They all fully believed that Lindsay was in fact an evil witch who had cast this hex on Irenia, which was spreading to all the other members of the coven. But in reality, Irenia, the leader of this coven, she didn't believe there was a hex. That had nothing to do with any of this.
Of course.
The whole coven thing was totally made up. She was just jealous that Lindsay was dating Jackie. Irenia had previously dated Jackie, and they had broken up, and Irenia still wanted to get back together, but Jackie didn't. And so now that Jackie was with Lindsay, Irenia just couldn't handle it. And so, naturally, Irenia had constructed this whole thing about Lindsay being one of the dark witches in Claremont, Illinois, and she's cast this hex, and now you, my witches in this coven, you need to go and kill her. But, of course, Lindsay did not end up getting killed, and instead, it was the totally innocent person, Josh, the Army private, who had nothing to do with any of this, who got killed. In addition to Josh dying, David, the warlock from St. Louis, he died from the shotgun blast to his stomach.
Damn.
And then Josh's mother, who had been stabbed repeatedly by David, she would actually survive her attack. Irenia would ultimately be found guilty of first-degree murder, and she would be sentenced to 57 years in prison. Rick pleaded guilty to murder as well, and he was sentenced to 20 years. And a third member of the coven, who was not present for the attack, but who after the fact helped cover it up, they were sentenced to 32 years in prison.
Okay, so I didn't like that.
One of the most haunted places in the entire United Kingdom is this little nondescript farmhouse in rural Wales. In 1989, Bill and Liz Rich, who were newlyweds, moved into their dream home, this little farmhouse in Wales. And pretty much right away, terrifying things began happening to them. They began hearing these loud footsteps marching around their second floor, but as soon as they went up there, there'd be nothing. And then Bill and Liz began randomly waking up in the middle of the night, and at the foot of their bed would be this dark figure just staring at them. Bill and Liz were terrified, but their fear was ratcheted up tenfold when their neighbors began telling them about their home's very dark and insidious history. And not long after that, Bill began to change. To hear the full terrifying story, listen to the special 2-part bonus Halloween episode on the Bedtime Stories podcast. This episode is called The Curse of Heol Vanog. And be sure to follow and listen to the Bedtime Stories podcast. I might have to actually listen to this. Wherever you get your podcasts to hear more bone-chilling stories. So that's going to do it. If you enjoyed today's story, be sure to check out our podcast called the Mr. Ballin Podcast that has literally hundreds of stories just like this one, but many of them are only available on the podcast. Again, it's called the Mr. Ballin Podcast, and it's available on Amazon Music.
Okay, Amazon Music. Huh. Nothing on... Yeah, okay. Alright, so... First of all, I don't know, maybe these were just significantly old images, but if I'm not mistaken, these people were supposed to be like, what, 16, 17, right? The other girl who was supposed to be the evil witch, she was 16 and pregnant. So, wouldn't that make Irenia also young? Or was Jackie old? I'm not sure, but I knew that this was bull. I knew it. I just didn't know. I wasn't expecting them to be exes, which is crazy to me. That's absolutely insane to me that they're exes, actually, because you would think that. Police would try to contact everyone in this 200 person town, I guess. I don't know. Like, that was so... You can make... Bro, that seems like a bad movie plot, bro. Like, they were that inexperienced, and then when it came down to Rick, yeah, he sprayed pepper spray in the bull eyes, but he sprayed pepper spray, but he wasn't the one who fatally stabbed him. So why did he plead guilty to murder? Like, he could have at least gotten manslaughter. Like yeah, the guy was stupid. Yes, this Rick is an idiot. He is, or mentally ill. He's one of those two things. But, like, come on, like, bro, like, I mean, they could have been somewhat laxed, I guess. I'm not sure, but yeah, it is now getting 42 minutes. Ooh. Yeah, I enjoyed this, and I might actually do way more. But they all seem somewhat long, but do I care though? But yeah, that is pretty much it. Happy Halloween. I might post another thing before I work. Yeah, I'll have to be before I work. But yeah, that's pretty much it.